My name is Isabel Carter, and I'm 31 years old. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in my hands when my mother walked in and changed everything. She didn't knock. She never knocked. That was the first thing I had learned growing up in that house. Space was not something you were entitled to, not even the space inside your own chest. She pulled out the chair across from me, sat down with the kind of deliberate slowness that meant she had rehearsed what she was about to say, and folded her hands on the table like she was about to deliver a business proposal. "Your brother is moving in with his 2 kids," she said. "So you need to leave. You're a parasite, Isabel. You always have been." I stared at her. The coffee in my mug had stopped steaming. The refrigerator hummed somewhere behind me. I heard every single sound in that kitchen, except the one that would have told me she was joking. "You're joking, right?" I asked. And even as the words left my mouth, I already knew the answer because my mother never joked about things that involved her comfort or my brother's convenience. She laughed, not warmly, not even awkwardly, just a short, flat sound that dismissed me before I could finish the sentence. "No," she said. "I'm serious. You have a week." I said nothing. I stood up, left the coffee on the table, walked to my room, pulled one suitcase from the top of the closet, and started folding clothes into it with the kind of mechanical focus you develop when you're trying very hard not to feel something enormous. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I had stopped arguing with my mother around the time I turned 24 and realized that every argument I won still left me feeling like I had lost something I couldn't name. I zipped the suitcase. I carried it to the front door. My father was sitting in the living room watching television, and he didn't look up. That was its own kind of answer. What neither of them knew. What they had never bothered to find out was that the house they were standing in, the house my mother had just evicted me from with the word parasite still hanging in the air between us, was mine. Not theirs. Mine. Every brick, every beam, every square foot of that property was legally, officially, and entirely in my name, had been for 3 years. Let me take you back to where this actually started, because the cruelty my mother showed me that morning did not appear from nowhere. It had roots, and those roots went deep. I grew up as the invisible child in a family where my brother, Callum, was the son that everyone orbited. Callum was 5 years older than me, loud and charming in the way that impresses adults who don't look closely. And from the time I was old enough to understand what favoritism meant, I understood that I was on the wrong side of it. My parents paid for Callum's college in full. Mine they contributed nothing toward. I worked 2 jobs through university, took out loans, graduated with a degree in finance, and a very specific kind of hunger that comes from being told your whole life that you are less than someone else in the same family. After graduation, I moved back home temporarily. That was the word I used, temporarily, while I saved money and looked for an apartment. Temporarily turned into 2 years, then 3. And somewhere in those years, my parents began to speak about me the way people speak about furniture they've gotten used to ignoring. My rent contributions were pocketed without acknowledgement. My groceries stocked the fridge without comment. The things I did to maintain the house, the repairs, the bills I quietly covered when my father's pension came up short, the property tax I paid 1 year when they simply did not have it. None of that was ever recorded in whatever internal ledger my mother kept about my worth as a human being. What was recorded, apparently, was Callum's need. Callum had gone through a divorce. Callum had 2 children. Callum needed space, and so I needed to go. Here is the part my mother did not know. 2 years before that morning, my father had come to me privately in a moment of unusual vulnerability and told me that the house was in danger. He had taken out a second mortgage years ago that neither he nor my mother had managed well, and the bank was moving toward foreclosure. He was ashamed. He didn't want my mother to know how bad it had gotten. He asked me if there was anything I could do. I had been working in finance for 6 years by then. I knew exactly what I could do. I negotiated with the bank. I restructured the debt, and I paid off the remaining balance in full using savings I had built through years of relentless discipline. In exchange, my father signed the title over to me. It was not a complicated transaction. It was clean, legal, and documented. My name went on the deed. His came off. My mother had never asked to see the deed. It had never once occurred to her to wonder whose name was on the property she lived in, because she had spent 30 years assuming that everything around her was hers by default. That assumption was about to cost her something significant. At 5 a.m. the next morning, my father called me nonstop, and the first thing he said was, "At 5 a.m." The next morning, my father called me nonstop, and the first thing he said was, "Isabel, your mother found the deed." I was lying awake in a budget hotel 2 miles from the house, staring at a water stain on the ceiling when my phone lit up with his name for the 7th time in 4 minutes. I answered on the 8th call. His voice was different from the version I had heard sitting silently in front of the television the night before. That version had been passive, uninvested, a man who had long ago handed over the responsibility of his emotions to whoever was loudest in the room. This version was shaking. She was looking for the insurance documents, he said, and she found the property papers in the filing cabinet. "Isabel, she doesn't understand. She's saying it's a mistake. She's saying your name shouldn't be on there." I let him finish. Then I said very quietly, "It's not a mistake, Dad. You know it's not a mistake." The silence that followed lasted so long, I checked my screen to see if the call had dropped. My mother called 20 minutes later. If my father's voice had been shaking, my mother's was volcanic. She had moved through shock and landed hard in fury, which was her natural habitat whenever reality refused to match her preferred version of events. She told me there had been some kind of error. She told me I had manipulated my father during a vulnerable moment. She used the word parasite again, which I thought was interesting given the circumstances. I let her talk. I had learned in 31 years exactly how long one of my mother's storms lasted before the first crack of uncertainty appeared, and I waited for it with the patience of someone who finally held every card on the table. "The house is mine, Mom," I said when she paused for breath. "It has been for 2 years. Dad came to me because you were months away from losing it to the bank. I paid off the debt. I have the title. I have every document. This is not a mistake, and it is not open for discussion." Another silence, longer this time. And then for the first time in my memory, my mother did not have an immediate response. What happened in the next 72 hours was something I had not fully planned for. Not because I hadn't thought about it, but because I had never let myself believe it would actually come. My mother called my aunt, who called my father's brother, who called me to explain that family property was a sensitive matter, and perhaps I should consider being more flexible. I listened to every one of them. I explained calmly and without anger the same facts each time. The house had been 2 months from foreclosure. My parents had not told anyone. I had intervened with my own money legally with a signed agreement. There was no flexibility to offer because there had been no wrongdoing to negotiate around. Callum called on the second day. This conversation was different from the others because Callum had always operated under the assumption that his charm would soften me the way it softened everyone else. He started with sympathy, told me he understood I was upset, that Mom had been harsh, that the parasite comment was uncalled for. I agreed that it was. Then he pivoted smoothly to his situation, his kids, his need for stability, and landed on the suggestion that perhaps I could simply let them all stay while I found somewhere else to live. Given that I was a single woman with a good income and much more flexibility than a divorced father of 2, I waited for him to finish. "Callum," I said, "you're asking me to vacate my own home so you can move in. I want you to hear yourself say that." He didn't have a clean answer for that. Nobody in my family, I was realizing, had ever been asked to hear themselves clearly before. I went back to the house on the 4th day. Not to fight, not to perform anything, but because it was my house, and I was done pretending otherwise. My mother was in the kitchen when I walked in. She looked smaller than she had 3 days ago, which happened to people sometimes when the architecture of their assumptions collapsed. My father was at the table. Neither of them spoke first, so I did. I told them that I had no intention of removing them from the property. I told them that I was not cruel despite having had cruelty modeled for me my entire life. I told them that Callum was welcome to visit his children, but he would not be moving in because the decision of who lived in that house now belonged to me, and not to anyone else in that room. My mother started to cry. I had seen her cry before in ways that were designed to end conversations and redirect blame, and I had learned to recognize the difference between that and something real. This was something real. In it, I saw a woman who had spent decades organizing her world around a hierarchy that had just been quietly, legally, and permanently dismantled by the child she had called a parasite. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was tired and sad. And also underneath those things, something that took me a moment to identify. It was solid. It was steady. It was the feeling of standing on ground that finally, unambiguously belonged to me. I set 2 conditions for moving forward. First, that the word parasite was never used in my presence again. Second, that every financial contribution I had made to that household over the years was acknowledged, not repaid, just acknowledged out loud by both of them. My father agreed immediately. My mother took 3 days, but she did it. Callum found a rental apartment. I repainted the hallway a color my mother had always vetoed. And every morning when I make coffee in that kitchen, I sit at the table and I let it go warm. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button right now, because every week we bring you real stories about people who stayed quiet, stood firm, and changed everything without saying a single unnecessary word. You don't want to miss what's coming.